Hi, everyone. We're here.
We
Thank you
are.
all so much for coming out. I know you could have done so many other things. You know, there's happy hour going on right now. You're missing out. You're missing out on an hour.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you can just drink later.
Double the price.
Oh, right,
when you
right,
leave.
yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Oh. No, they're all so happy to be here. Look at them. I just want to start by congratulating you. This is such an incredible achievement, and it's something that I hope everyone reads. I'll be giving a lot of gifts this year that are your book.
Thank you, Tavi.
And I want to know, first of all, what it was like to write a second book about your life after your audience grew and you got to know them, and did you feel any type of expectation or what was it like doing it with more faces to put to the readers?
Yeah, I think that one of the greatest challenges with returning to the form and writing about myself again was the sense of that trust, right? Like trusting myself first. So sitting with myself again and really feeling as if I have something else to say. In theory, I believe I had something else to say, but on the same end, I also was like, is there more that I can write beyond just the journey I had through my body? Because oftentimes with trans genre memoirs, all of it is largely about our transition, our medical and social transitions, how we struggled with our gender in the world. And so I felt like I did that, and I was like, I don't want to have to do that again and repeat that for my readers. So I trusted my readers to either have come to the text with their own knowledge and glossary and definitions and terminologies, or to so I trusted them in that sense. And then going back to this text to just be able to write about my 20s was so freeing in a sense. It was so freeing to be able to just say what it's like to be a young woman in the world with these experiences, and trying to like being hungry for stuff, being hungry for love, hungry for desire, hungry for pleasure, hungry for career fulfillment and fulfillment in all of the spaces, and not, you know, unproblematic roommates and all of the things.
The roommate stuff was particularly hard to read. Yeah, I know that with your first book, Redefining Realness, you started by writing journal entries just to get all of the memories down. Did this start the same way?
Well, this started in a women's writers residency called Hedgebrook. It's in Washington State. They invited me during the madness of my first book tour. And I was just like, I don't have time for this. I don't want to do this. And then I was like, okay, I'll just take the space. I'll take a couple weeks in August and I'll go. And so when I went there, I like had to face myself again, and I had to pause. And it was, because you have a little cabin, like they give you a little cottage, they feed you, they give you everything, and you're just with yourself. There's no internet service, there's no Wi-Fi. And so you're just kind of, I was just like, oh, I have to pause. And so I paused, I sat with myself, and then I found this book. And I found myself returning to a lot of the questions that a lot of young people were asking me about how was I able to do it, right? They were like, great, we got the trans memoir, revolutionary, great, that's first one person of color, first one a young person, but girl, how were you able to work at People magazine? How were you able to move to New York City? How were you able to be like the first generation college student? All these things, and I was like, oh. And so in answering those questions, I had to return to being a young person again in the world. It's not like I'm an elder, but I do think that there is this sense, in the trans community though, I am an elder. To be 34 years old, you know, the life expectancy of trans folk, particularly trans women of color, is 30. And so for me, thinking about that, I was like, what are the stories that I wish someone had told me? What is the roadmap that I would have wanted to be able to follow, if I wanted to follow one at all, to any sense of figuring out how to find all of these different spaces for me to actually be able to show up as fully myself.
There is one, well, okay, first of all, I have a lot of questions about this residency.
Yeah.
Were you like seeing were you like then having meals with the other women there?
Yeah, so
or?
your only requirement is that you show up for 6 dinners, or 6, so each week you had one requirement, which was like every day you show up for a meal. And so usually it was dinners, and then on Sundays it was a brunch. And so you sit with 7 other writers from all over the world, because it's a global thing.
Whoa.
So, and you kind of leave with this pack of like really great, you know, women writers with different experiences. You have really heated conversations. I found myself having to come out sometimes at at the table when a new person comes and people go and then someone else comes and takes over the cottage or the cabin that they were staying at. So you have to get kind of comfortable with like talking about your work, talking about what you're working on, talking about the world. When I went the first time, it was great that I had one person who knew who my work was. She was a great like advocate to talk about it. And that's a bizarre thing with like disclosure and being trans or whatnot, is that you often have to, if you can blend in as cis, you have to constantly, like, coming out and disclosure is like a daily process for me. It's not something that like I did it once and now I'm done with it. It's like constantly having to shed these layers, constantly having to share parts of myself with people. And it's never just a light conversation where it's like, I'm trans and then we move on. Then I'm like talking about myself and my transition and all this stuff, and it's like it kind of never ends. And I'm like, well, there is my book in the library, you know, so in the Hedgebrook Library, you can read it. It's called Redefining Realness. And then they'll read it, and then they come to you at the end, you know, like in a couple days later, and then it's like this weird, awkward moment where you're like, I can't believe this happened. Because they still then see you as the child you were, that you were writing about those experiences. And so that's also a bizarre part with writing memoirs, that people have this very immediate experience with having just experienced something that you experienced years ago, but are still placing you there because they're still there and they're just experiencing it.
Oh, wow.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of experiencing.
Well, I just hadn't even thought about the, you know, you revisit it to write it, but then like by the time it's published, it's, you know, a little out of sight, out of mind, but then for the reader, it's a different thing, and for everyone who encounters it. I feel like Surpassing Certainty does a really good job of, there are like so many things happening at once, because on one hand, you are very considerate and thoughtful around people who might not know, a reader who might not know the terminology. Mm-hmm. It also doesn't feel like you're just trying to educate those guys. Yeah. And it feels like you're speaking your truth, but you're also very explicit in the intro about wanting to give other trans women of color something to see themselves in. So there is that motivation behind all of it. How do you manage those different audiences when you're writing, or what kind of decisions get made in writing or editing around like striking that very particular balance?
What was really great this time around was that, I kind of alluded to it a little earlier, was that when we thought about audience, I wasn't thinking so much about the uninitiated. That was kind of the term my editor talked about in the first book, which was like, for the uninitiated, how would you phrase, you know, da-da-da-da, or like, maybe here you can add, you know, terminology, or maybe here you can kind of widen the scope or offer statistics or da-da-da. And so that's why I think, which is what largely made Redefining Realness so great as a text, was that it's so accessible, because it gives you the personal narrative, but at the same time, it also then gives you the education piece, the Trans 101 piece, that enables you to digest and understand on certain levels the very complicated experience of being a young trans woman of color. Mm-hmm. So, or one trans woman of color's experience. And so with Surpassing Certainty, when I thought about audience, I really was just thinking about the things that I wanted someone, a woman like myself, to tell me when I was younger, and which was largely the truth. I wanted someone who's going to tell me the truth about disclosure, because no one had told me about that before. The only model I knew about disclosure was that you try to achieve to be as passable as possible so that you can blend in with society and move away from your place of becoming and just live your life. And so I had done that. I followed that roadmap. That was the roadmap for liberation. I did it. I got there. And then I was able to make the decision, because I felt safe enough, because I had economic power, because I had access, because I had certain privileges, to then be able to step forward at 27 and tell my story and be fully, you know, content and unapologetic about my life experiences. And so with Surpassing Certainty, I wanted to concentrate on the years when I was not unapologetic, when I was unsure, when I didn't have anything to follow. And so I thought about, what did she need to know then? That's kind of how I centered it. And in terms of the balancing for other readers, I was like, I already done a text that offers people language and all that stuff. They can go read that text and then come to this one, or read this one first and then return to that one. But I just tried, I think I always try to talk about the personal and then contextualize in the sense of breaking away and saying, that this is how it could have been different for someone else who had different experiences, or I was lucky enough and privileged enough in this space. And so I'm always conscious about positionality of my own personal experience and where am I positioned in the world, so that it made me able to navigate certain spaces beyond luck, beyond blessings, beyond, just kind of hitting the jackpot in certain aspects, but actually what were the parts of my experiences or my physical attributes and all that stuff that has enabled me to be able to be seen and heard.
Well, to that end, you're very generous throughout the book and, letting us in on mistakes you made or, things you didn't understand when you were younger about terminology or what other women were going through, and, encounters or conversations with friends or coworkers where someone explained something to you that you didn't know before. And I think that's something that people are more and more afraid of doing now because the great thing about a book is you have to read it to know what's in it.
Yeah.
But on the internet, it's really easy to take something out of context or just skim something and see mistakes as, someone frozen in time. And I think it's great to, let people in on that, because certainly everyone's at a different point in their own journey. And I want to know what got you to that place where you were comfortable being vulnerable in that way.
Well, I think largely I kind of, as I set out, that my intentionality with this book was really to think about centering myself when I was in process. And so I noticed when I moved to New York City, I thought that a lot of my consciousness would be around, say, gender issues or something like that. And I really kind of found my voice and really was checked and challenged a lot in the racial space, right? With other Black women, like the fact that I was able to tap in to a network of other magazine intern Black women who were looking for space in a industry that was not really reflecting them. Like the year that I interned at one of these fashion magazines, there was not a single woman of color on the cover. And so we wanted to engage in an industry that didn't ever really reflect us. Right. And so that was something that we were kind of grappling with, but then still kind of hungry to be a part of. We wanted to be invited to the table. We wanted to be able to tell stories, our stories. And so a lot of those conversations, a lot of my learning came through sitting down at lunch with these other Black girl interns and learning about the ways in which I was read by them, the way in which I would probably be read by some magazine editors that were hiring us or prospective bosses. And being a mixed Black girl, being a Black girl that is also Native Hawaiian, I wasn't even thinking about the privileges of my skin color and hair texture and the way in which I speak and present. And so the fact that I was digestible for some white editors, safe for some white woman editors that were hiring us, that was like a hard pill to swallow to hear from other Black girls, but it was the truth. And so I wanted to share that nuance. Right now we're having conversations about Tinashe, aren't we? About her saying stuff like, Black people don't understand me because I'm mixed. It's the same conversation we have over and over and over about this stuff. And it's we need to talk about the ways in which we're different, even within Black communities, people of color communities, really being clear about that there are certain ways in which there's hierarchies because of the closeness to whiteness or whatnot. And so these are things that I learned largely through interning and being with these other women. I forgot what your original question was.
Oh,
I went on a long tangent.
Just keep talking, please.
But yeah, so I
Yeah.
wasn't really afraid of talking because I had already experienced the moment of being kind of ashamed when I said certain things. You'll read the book and you'll see the moments that I cringe at. But I was I think it's necessary to show that I didn't always, everyone's how do you say the perfect things all the time? And I'm I don't say the perfect things all the time, but it's when the camera's on, then I can be very careful. But there were many points in my life, and still every single day when I say quite problematic things. And there were a time in my life when I often was uninformed, when I wasn't as conscious as I am now about certain things. And I'm still in process now, learning about all kinds of different intersections and communities. Oh, and that it's
Yeah.
also harder to experience these things than it is to mess up and say the wrong thing, right? So we need to have these conversations. We need to
Right.
be able to talk frankly and clearly about the ways in which we have gaps in comprehension and consciousness when it comes to other people's life experiences.
Well, when you were revisiting your years at these fashion magazines or at people.com and talking about these issues of representation, did it feel like, reflecting on it now, like things have changed much, or did it feel very different from what it's like to work in media now?
It does. Well, when I first kind of really got my big first job, which was at People magazine, I was a digital editor there, and we were the hot young team that was coming in to do digital at Time Inc. And we had MySpace too, and like that's not around anymore. So things shift and change, and like Twitter wasn't quite there then, and so people weren't having these conversations in the way that they're having them every single day. And so we were able to, at that time, be able to just send out stories and headlines and not really have to have a conversation with our readers beyond the comment section. And so there's no way now that you can publish something and not get commentary from your readers, especially if you're reaching millions of people, because now what's happening is that largely this is a conversation. No longer does some magazine or journalist get to say something without someone then saying something back about the way in which they felt about that piece. And so what I love so much now about the internet is that there's that level for these courageous conversations. And on the other level, there's a sense of more voices, more personal essays, more perspectives, more YouTube channels, more shows, more podcasts, which is exciting because you have more stories and more voices. And though there is a fragmentation that's happening now in media, I think it's fine to be able to subscribe to the things that you want and be able to have that safe space for yourself, however you see fit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best pieces of advice a teenage rookie reader gave me was Instagram should make you happy. I was like, oh, because normally scrolling through it is like a kind of a nightmare.
Why is it an Instagram or Twitter? Twitter's a nightmare sometimes for me, but
Twitter I've fully
Instagram.
given up on.
But how is Instagram a nightmare? What is it? I want to hear that.
It's just
I'm not trying to interview you, but
no. Tables have turned. It's just the compare and despair thing.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of FOMO, right?
Yeah. FOMO. I mean, it's
how is her highlighter so popping? How
Yeah,
can
I
why am I
know.
not at this party? I wasn't invited to this party.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of very famous friends too.
I do. It's so hard. I mean, no.
So your
I
fear of
think,
missing out is a whole other.
well, I think
layer.
no, I think the key there is maybe famous Instagram friends, and that's the gap.
Yeah.
Where I'm like,
Interesting.
this is not my life. But yeah, she was like, just follow a bunch of artists, and then when you look at it, it'll be a bunch of beautiful artwork, or follow people who share positive messages instead of a relative who makes you feel weird. I'm just kidding. I love all
We
of
all
my
have that
relatives.
uncle. We know that.
In your book, a big part of it is pop culture, and you describe it as an obsession, as sometimes for you a distraction. But all throughout, there are all of these references to different TV shows and movies and musical artists, and how they informed the way you and your family and your roommates and your boyfriend and all of these people came to view each other and have perceptions about New York City, about people of different races, about queer people and trans folks. And I am curious, and it's something that in reading it and it all being kind of in retrospect is so illuminating about where everyone in your story is coming from. When did you realize it was more than just an obsession, and it was this way of understanding how people treat each other and why?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think one of the things that really enabled me to engage in this space so much more as a journalist was knowing that I couldn't have spent my entire life engaging with certain cultural products with that in not having value. Do you know what I mean? Like I could not
Right.
have spent that much time watching TV, watching VHS. Watching TRL, listening to Destiny's Child, listening to Janet Jackson, and not mean something. It must have meant something for me to engage in that space, to spend so much of my young life in that space. And I think about the ways in which it was an escape for me from difficult realities. It was a refuge from so much stuff that was going on in my young life when I was feeling, and I love that you always say this, when you're a teenager, you feel feeling so intensely. And so thinking about that, for me, when I went to journalism school, I was just like, I don't know if I want to just be another like New York Times war reporter. I think I'm good. I think there's enough of those. And so like, how can I, write about Angelina Jolie and her kids? And so there was a part of that for me where I think I needed just that time to engage in that space. And I think it wasn't until probably after I told my story and took a break from pop culture reporting and just started doing advocacy work and doing speeches and writing essays about, my own personal experiences and the experiences of my communities, that I was able to then have reflection and be like, oh, these don't have to be two different worlds. Because they exist in me and they're my interests, I can bring them together. And I think that being a trans woman of color, being a journalist that I could, and a pop culture fan that I could, and someone who has this consciousness around social justice issues, that I can bring all of that in there. And I don't have to I can be a critical fan, and I can write about what these certain pop cultural products and people say about us, and what they say about where we need to go, and what they say about our gaps in comprehension right now. And so I just started using that as a jumping off point, because one of the best things you can do at a dinner party or something is talk about the Real Housewives. Everyone has some kind of interaction with that, and it's a shared like common language that you can then go jump off and talk about all kinds of different other issues.
Right, it's like, come for the reality TV and stay for the lessons about intersectionality.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. If it,
I'm like maybe with Atlanta you could. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Anyways. In this book, a lot of it is about, without giving anything away.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
She was a stripper.
Oh, well, there's that, which was like, it's in the first few chapters, so it's not really a spoiler.
Exactly.
But a lot of it is about a relationship that you talk about having made the choice to omit it from your first book. What was the motivation behind including it in this one?
I think there was no way to write about the time period that I was writing about in Surpassing Certainty without including Troy, who's a character in the book, who was my first love. When I wrote Redefining Realness, I largely centered it, or kind of gave, what is the term I'm looking for? Bookended it, literally, with my love story with Aaron, disclosing to meeting him, our love story, disclosing to him, and then seeing what his reaction is in the last chapter. But he wasn't the first man I ever told that I was trans to, and he wasn't the first man that I told that I was trans to who accepted me and still loved me. It was stronger to sell the first book in that kind of a way, or to frame it in that way. But in Surpassing Certainty, I really unpack and talk about the challenging and complicated and, intensely felt feelings of first love. And also navigating the tricky space and oftentimes treacherous and dangerous and misconceptions-filled space of disclosure for trans women in romantic partnership with cisgender straight guys. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with telling that story was to use it as a backdrop of my own progression. You learn so much when you spend about 5 years with one person in some sense, though there was a lot of, I was gonna say fuck boys. Well, I guess you can say fuck boys in between. I was like trying to find like the male equivalent of side chick, but I guess it would be fuck boy, wouldn't it?
As a non-expert, yes, that sounds right. There are definitely fuckboys in this book.
Yeah, there's a lot. Sex positivity. And so it was like this sense of wanting to ensure that I was being honest about that relationship and how much it really contributed to my sense of self. I spent so much time with this person, so it must have meant something. And so because of that time period that we were together and it coincided with the book, there was no way that I couldn't write. That relationship is such a major theme and backdrop in Surpassing Certainty.
There's something you say in the intro that I was just reminded of when you're talking about the complications around disclosure and who's, in a space where they can do that safely. And you say it's not about, I'm paraphrasing it, read the book, which you're going to, but...
So book lovers here.
Yeah. But you say something like, trans women aren't trying to pass for cis women. We are women. And was just so, it's at the very beginning of the book, but it's so succinctly put. And even though you go into all of the, different relationships where you're navigating that kind of sets the tone in a really beautiful way. And I don't really have a question about that. I just thought that was, I am just very, no, that's it. There are a lot of different elements and a lot of different narratives, and you have the relationship with Troy while you have all these other encounters with other people. And I'm curious actually if having done the first book, there was anything you learned from tapping back into all of that emotionally that you could kind of lean on this time around.
Tapping back emotionally. I'm a little tired. Sorry, my brain is not working as fast as it should be.
I don't know if that was obvious or not,
but I think that, it's always hard in the sense of writing about your own life experiences. It's safe when you're sitting there alone in a room with your legal pad or your computer and telling yourself the truth or telling yourself your own stories. It's difficult then when those stories, specifically harder trigger points and experiences, are then shared out. What's so great is I was talking about a little bit earlier about trusting your reader. I trust my readers unabashedly. I don't think that anyone would come to this book trying to get me or trying to trigger me or they're coming to this book because they want to read the book. You don't spend that much time with a book or with a person in a book and think of or having bad intentions or something. And so for me, that trust enables me to lean emotionally on that trust, that conversation, the giving and bearing witness, the telling and sharing. And so that's what I love so much about the genre memoir. You did pick up a little bit about disclosure and opening the book there. The introduction of the book is about a moment where I'm sitting in a nightclub, and this has happened to me dozens of times, and I'm 19 years old, about to turn 20, and someone I know from kind of vaguely recognizable from high school who knew me when I was transitioning, because I transitioned through high school, and she was standing at the bar, and this guy came up, and I was dancing with him and all this stuff. When I went to the restroom, she then outed me to him, and you see what kind of happens in that moment. And I think about sometimes the most treacherous spaces are oftentimes the spaces in which we are trying to just be ourselves and show up as we are, and then other people have other things to say about how we show up in the world, and how that can also be dangerous, and how we also strip people of agency, and we take their stories and we give our own commentary and our own language onto that, and we label them, and we don't know what could have happened if it took another turn when he heard this information, if he believed her, if he, all of this stuff. And so I just feel like that's almost the everyday experience for a lot of trans folk who are navigating these spaces. And so for me, I had made it to that other side. So I was like, my sense of telling it, there was no high risk. I'm not in that space anymore in that same way. So I thought I should probably tell it so that hopefully no one else does what she did again, and what a lot of the people in the book do, and a lot of things that I did too, to avoid those pitfalls.
Right.
I don't think I answered your question at all.
I don't know what my question was, so, but now I do have to consult my notes. So this is a bit of a callback, because I went back to when Julianne Shepard interviewed you for Rookie in 2014, And you
One
had
of my favorite conversations.
Oh.
So good.
mine too, as someone who was not in it. That wasn't supposed to be like sad. As a reader, I was a fan. But in it, you have a Post-it on your desk that said ownership and perception. What does that
Oh,
Post-it
you're going to check me
say
on what
now?
mine said. It still says it.
Oh, I mean, do you have a different... obviously,
have
that
another one.
Post-it still
I
says
do
the
have-
same thing.
I think I have one that just says, be stingy.
Oh.
Because a lot of people ask a lot of, people ask a lot of you. There's a lot of, how am I going to word this? Trying not to be problematic. There's a lot of demands to be made on your time. And for me, my greatest fantasy would be able to have 2 full free days a week to not do anything, to not show up, to not have to produce, to be able to just sit and maybe read, to sit and like maybe write, but without the expectation of having it to be something great. This book, Surpassing Certainty, took so much work because I had so many different demands and obligations. Whereas in my first book, it was a lot easier because I got a book deal, I quit my job, and I just started writing. Whereas this one was like, I did that same thing, but my job was just my life, and my job was my activism, my job was the work I had to do. And so I had to figure out how to say no, how to be like, I should be able to not do anything, to just sit and write. And so for me, the be stingy is a reminder to me that it's okay to take care of myself first. And I think that's kind of a theme of this book. It's like, take the time you need to center yourself, to take care of yourself before you think about doing anything else for anyone else.
Yeah. Oh no, that's so important. I mean, was it hard to get back to that feeling of, as though you have this big expanse of time to just write and everything not have to be perfect right away, while also, interviewing people yourself, doing all of these other producing jobs and everything you're describing?
Well, the Trans List took a big chunk of my time. It's an HBO documentary that I produced and did all of the interviews for. And it took a lot of time away from my being able to sit and write, but the project was so important and it was not about me. So it also then made me want to do it more. Whereas a memoir is like, I'm just sitting and writing about me, which is like fun. And so, so it's, I do enjoy being not so much the subject, but being the person asking the question. That's my more natural state, the person framing the conversation. But I do think that it's important that because I have access to these spaces to be able to tell the stories that I feel that aren't there, and the stories that I wish I would have had at a library or a bookstore to be able to read and stuff. And so I have such a precious love for books. That's why I love the Strand. That's why it's, the launch event for my book. It's such a special place. I've sat in its stacks and read so many books, and I probably pocketed a couple. Stunt queen realness. Yeah.
Well, on that note, in the book, you say that you aspire daily to be like Toni Morrison Sula, a woman who shuns the demands placed on her by her watchful community, a woman who lacks ego, a woman okay in her otherness. What other characters or literature inspired you?
Janie Crawford, from their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, is still, I think, my favorite protagonist. I wished I had a body that when you wore overalls, that it looks like you had grapefruits in your back pockets. That is like the best, black girl, body goals description ever. But not just for her physicality, but also just the journey that she was on as a young woman who went out and lived in the world, and then came back to be able to tell her story to her best friend. A lot of people, I think, there's so many different ways to read, but I was about to say misread the book and see it as just a woman who's like on a chase for men or something, or finding herself in men. But I think that these relationships were a part of her life, and she was experiencing the world, and then she came back to tell her best friend, a woman, and give testimony barefoot on her back porch, telling her story, and that has always inspired me. So she's definitely, and then like real life protagonist heroine who's no longer with us, Maya Angelou. The way in which she was able to editorialize her life experiences and her stories and give us lessons in really powerful stories and language has always been a way in which I've been able to do this work and to write myself onto these books and these shelves.
Are we getting a time signal? Yeah, okay. Well, should we open it up to audience questions?
Please.
If you want to raise your hand, I will try to bring you the mic, and you will make it easy for me by being in the front row.
Hi, Janet. How
Hi.
are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Amazing to be here and meet you.
Oh,
The question I have is, as a woman yourself, and going through your transition, I have two questions. What was the hardest thing you faced, in going through that and feeling when people were around you and there was non-acceptance of who you were as a person? What was the hardest thing that you faced inside? And then the second question I have is, how did you get to a point of, at a point now, I don't give a damn. Okay, I'm who I am, and that's it. Like me, you don't, you don't. And that
I don't think I've gotten to that point. I may project that, but I still have to be blocked by my husband from searching my name in Twitter and online and stuff. But the first question, the most difficult thing I think for me was, the most difficult thing during my transition was getting the coin. Then number two would probably be in terms of resistance of how other people saw me. I feel like I was more unabashed when I was younger about like my identity and not really caring what people thought about me. I think that was the only way I was able to transition through middle school and high school. There were some family points, like particularly with my father, that was really difficult, and I don't think that I really understood the gravity of not being able to have open conversations about my identity with him, how that affected me later on in life. It took me time to get over that, and we're in a good place now, but there's still that trickiness around that. There is a fuller embrace of each other, but we have a very strained, difficult, complicated, complex relationship as anyone would have with one's parent.
I'll try to make my way over there.
Hi. My question is more about writing
Yay.
and framing. Yay. So, admittedly, I work in publishing on the academic side. So, but
When anyone saw that, she was like, oh.
yeah. But I have a lot of writer friends and friends of color, and it seems like there's a not quite catch-22, but basically like you want to write about yourself and your experiences, but then everybody keeps asking you to write about yourself and your experiences. And at some point, you kind of feel like there's this, well, not you specifically, but a lot of people feel like there's this endless cycle of doing that. And so my question to you is, do you ever feel like you're constantly writing different like things about yourself or your experiences? And do you ever feel like, it somehow impacts, whether positively or negatively, your ability to create outside of yourself?
That's a great question. I do, I think about where everyone talks about like the think piece economy or what was the Jane Pratt, what is it called? Oh, It Happened to Me kind of essay form, where it's just basically largely marginalized people and women going forward and telling their most shocking, clickbaity stories that they can tell, because that's a way for them to continue to be published and to make a living, right? And so for me, I think I felt that urgency a lot more with my first book, in a sense of like feeling obligated to have to write my transition memoir because that was the only gateway oftentimes, or the first gateway for trans folk to get published, is to write a story about the body. And so I did, but there were certain things where I was like, well, we're gonna make it different. You know, there's not many from Black people and a young person, so like, let's fuck it up a little bit. Let's be subversive this way. So that's how I like, you know, talked myself into it. But with the second book, I didn't really feel like that, but I did have a reluctancy because I felt a lot of people were in largely like literary spaces. You know, which are just like, oh, it's a memoir, and you know, like that's not serious work. And so I had to like at first I was like, I'm gonna do an ideas book about like beauty and aesthetics and beauty culture. That's what I wanted to write, and it's gonna be like the new Naomi Wolf, you know, the beauty method. It's gonna be like my version. And then like I sat in a cottage and I was like, I. And I was comfortable there, and I found myself just writing, and there was like a flow and there was a comfort in it. I don't know if I'm gonna write a memoir anytime again soon. Like I feel like I'm tapped out on material. But I do understand the conflict, but I didn't feel pulled to have to write another book. I wanted to write this book, and I wanted to write this book largely because I felt like one like it doesn't really exist. Though in trans communities we have conversations often about living stealth, which I define in the book, and not really having those stories. And I did feel like there was a gap where I've always wanted those women who went away to come and tell me what happened, or come and tell us what happened and how they made it and what did that look like. And so I was like, I lived that experience, so let me try to tell that story so that there's not so much a gap in comprehension, because I feel like there is a lost part of our generation where we don't have that intergenerational conversation with a lot of elders who felt that that was the only way they were able to live and to survive and to have access.
Hi, Janet. I'm a
Hi.
big fan.
Oh,
My name is
thank you.
Jay.
Hi, Jay.
I have a question about sort of something more serious. And I guess that I saw your interview last night, Seth Meyers' interview, and you said that you wanted to get your first book out of the way because you felt that it was different in terms of the narrative. And I guess that I was thinking about violence towards trans folk and gender nonconforming folk. It's often, not always, the targets are people of color, trans women of color, and I guess that because you were sort of growing into adulthood as a young trans woman, you were, poor and Black. All these identities, you were sort of navigating them. I guess what advice would you give to someone who's also navigating these identities and kind of thinking about how do we change the discourse in our communities? Like I think about being gender nonconforming, and also like the violence that that's really threatening in kind of these communities. Like I think about Laverne Cox, who said that she often gets sort of threatening slurs thrown at her from Black men or communities, working class communities. I guess like what advice would you give to young gender nonconforming people of color or trans people of color that are navigating these spaces, and how to change the conversation in these communities?
So you're talking about intra-community kind of like policing and violence and harassment that happen? Some of my greatest heroines are the girls that I see in my neighborhood in Harlem who are stomping through the streets, who are living in a predominantly Black neighborhood, who are grappling with having to, just go to the clinic, to go to work at Jamba Juice. I always say Jamba Juice because there's a girl I see all the time at Jamba Juice. So she's like my point. I'm like, hey, girl. And just thinking about the ways in which she navigates, the world, public space, a city like New York, where our bodies, we're not protected by cars, right? We are bumping into each other every single day. And I think about the vulnerability that's there and how, I can jump in an Uber and it's like, or a cab, or someone sends a car for me. I'm safe in most spaces I'm in. I'm like shepherded through the world. And so like I'm detached in a sense from like what it's like to be a young woman living in this particular city, a young gender nonconforming person living in this city where we're sold this Bill of Rights or this thought that like we're so progressive and liberal and nothing bad happens in New York, come to New York, right? So that's why a lot of LGBT youth come to New York City, is because that's what we sell. But at the same time, just last week, two trans women of color were attacked, and they're in the hospital and they have needs, and we need to take care of them, and we have to do the GoFundMes and all of that. So what advice I would give, the Surpassing Certainty is that, like, it has that, so I don't really know if I can like soundbite advice, but I think what's important is like ensuring that you don't fall into the trap of you have to do this alone. I think that was largely one of the things that that I fell into, and so I had like an isolating experience at times. I thought I couldn't ask anyone for help, and so figuring out and finding those people that can surround you, that can affirm you, that can nod when you have something great to say, knowing too in your heart of hearts, in your core, that all that you feel and all that you know about yourself is true, and that no one can dictate that for you. And in terms of dealing with problematic ass people you have to live around, that is going to be life, period. If you're gonna live in the world, you're gonna have to deal with people who are gonna have something to say about you, but that doesn't mean it has to shift or adapt the way that you say about yourself. And if you feel unsafe, hopefully you have the agency to not be able to engage in that space anymore. And as folk of color, oftentimes, the police stuff is not something we're gonna do, which is a whole complicated other layer to that. But, because we know we ain't safe with the police either. So yeah, tangent, there you go. Do we have to do it?
We have time for one or two more questions. Anybody in the back over here? I'll bring it over here. Oh.
Hi, Janet.
Hi.
I wanted to know, when is So Popular coming back?
So Popular is canceled. She's done. She's dead. She lived a great life. But she's living on the internet, and she's, there forever. But I do hope that I do hope to have another space. I'm working on a couple of projects. But my podcast, Never Before, is a nice alternative. It launched 3 weeks ago with Miss Tina Knowles-Lawson, the Queen Mother herself. Yeah, amazing. I still can't believe it. And then Representative Maxine Waters was my latest guest, but came on yesterday. So subscribe to Never Before. It's a reprieve, but it brings that same sense of the tone of wanting to have conversations with people who are contributing to the world and saying things that they've never kind of said in public before. And we have like a really great slate of guests. And it's a pop cultural space, but it's also a super personal space. I cried in front of Miss Tina. My 16-year-old self watching Destiny's Child on TV, on MTV, and shredding all of my, clothes that I bought to emulate their outfits, being able to say, just to give her that thanks and that gratitude for the way in which she shaped these women, and she also contributed as a creative force, creating those outfits that I was trying to emulate. But yeah, So Popular was canceled because the election came. MSNBC needed to do other things. They let go of a slate of people. I was one of those people, and I moved on with my life. Thank you all so much. So grateful for all of you coming out. So grateful to Tavi for having this conversation with me. I look forward to meeting each and every one of you at the book signing. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank all of you for coming out tonight.